He was 26 years old, and his feet hurt every single night. That was the first thing he noticed when he finally sat down after a 12-hour shift at the restaurant. Not the tips in his pocket or the rude customers, or the way his back ached from carrying heavy trays, just the burning in his feet that reminded him he had been standing since early morning. The restaurant was one of those fancy places downtown where rich people came to celebrate birthdays and anniversaries and business deals. They ordered expensive wine and appetizers that cost more than what he made in an hour. He smiled at them and refilled their water glasses and pretended like he belonged in that world, but he knew the truth. He was just the guy who brought their food, nothing more and nothing less. His name tag said server, but sometimes it felt like it should say invisible people looked right through him most nights. They saw the uniform and the tray and the polite smile, but they never really saw him. And honestly, he had made peace with that a long time ago. Being invisible meant he could disappear into his own thoughts while he worked. He could hear music in his head, even when the restaurant was loud and crowded. He could imagine his fingers dancing across piano keys, even while his hands carried plates of steak and lobster. That was his secret. The thing nobody at work knew about him. Thing he never talked about because talking about it made it feel too real and too painful. He loved the piano more than anything in this world. He had loved it since he was 7 years old, when his grandmother took him to church for the first time. She was a proud woman who believed that Sunday mornings belonged to God, as she dressed him in his best clothes and held his hand as they walked up those old wooden steps. The church was small and the paint was peeling, and the pews creaked when people sat down. But none of that mattered when the music started. There was an old woman who played the piano at that church, and she had gray hair pulled back in a tight bun, and her fingers moved like water flowing over rocks. He remembered sitting there with his mouth open, just watching her hands. How could someone make sounds like that? How could wooden keys and metal strings create something that made his chest feel tight and his eyes feel wet? His grandmother noticed him staring, and she smiled that knowing smile she always had after the service. She walked him up to the piano and asked the old woman if the boy could touch it. The woman looked down at him, and her eyes were kind and tired and full of years he could not yet understand. She nodded and stepped aside. He reached out with one small finger and pressed a single key. The note rang out through the empty church, and it felt like the whole world stopped for just a moment. That was the beginning of everything. His grandmother could not afford piano lessons, but she found a way. She asked around the neighborhood until she found a retired music teacher who agreed to teach him for free in exchange for help with groceries and yard work. Every Saturday morning, he would walk 6 blocks to that woman's house and sit at her old upright piano and learn. She taught him how to read music and how to position his hands and how to feel the rhythm in his bones. Instead of just counting beats in his head, she told him he had a gift. She told him some people play piano and some people speak through it, and he was the second kind. He practiced every chance he got at school. There was an old keyboard in the music room, and he would sneak in during lunch to play at the community center. There was a piano that was always out of tune, but he played it anyway. He dreamed of going to music school and becoming a real pianist and playing on big stages where people would actually see him. But dreams have a way of crashing into reality. When he was 17, his mother got sick. It started with headaches that would not go away, and then it became something much worse. The doctors used words he did not understand and handed them bills they could not pay. His grandmother was too old to work, and his younger sister was only 14. So he did what he had to do. He dropped out of school and got a job bussing tables at a diner. The music had to wait. That was what he told himself over and over. Music would wait for him, and one day, when things got better, he would come back to it. But things did not get better. They got harder. His mother needed surgery, and then physical therapy, and then more surgery. His grandmother passed away 2 years later, and he held her hand in the hospital and promised her he would take care of the family. His sister needed money for school supplies and clothes, and eventually, college applications. The diner job turned into a server job at a nicer restaurant, which turned into the fancy place downtown, where he worked. Now 9 years had passed since he first put on an apron. 9 years of saying yes sir and yes ma'am and can I get you anything else? 9 years of hiding who he really was. But he never stopped playing. Could not stop even if he wanted to. There was a church about 6 blocks from his apartment, and it had an old grand piano that nobody used during the week. He had discovered it by accident one night when he was walking home and heard music coming from inside. He peeked through the window and saw the custodian playing a few simple hymns. The next night he went back and introduced himself. The custodian was an older man with white hair and kind eyes, and he listened while this young server explained how much he loved the piano and how he had nowhere to play. The old man did not ask many questions. He just handed him a key and told him he could come by any night after 9. That was 3 years ago now. Every single night after his shift ended, he would walk those 6 blocks and let himself into the church. He would sit at that piano and play until his fingers ached and his heart felt empty. In the best possible way, he played classical pieces he had memorized as a kid. He played jazz standards he had taught himself from YouTube videos. Played his own compositions that came from somewhere deep inside him, music he had never written down, because writing it down would make it too real. The church was always dark and quiet and empty, just him and the piano and the shadows of the pews. Sometimes he cried while he played. Sometimes he laughed. Sometimes he just closed his eyes and let his hands move on their own, like they knew something his brain did not. Those hours at the piano were the only time he felt like himself, the only time he was not invisible. But when the clock hit midnight, he would close the piano lid and lock up the church and walk home to his small apartment. He would set his alarm for 6 in the morning and lay down on his bed and stare at the ceiling, and he would remind himself that this was his life, now serving tables during the day and playing piano in secret. At night, dreams were for people who could afford them. He had a family to take care of. He had bills to pay. The music would just have to stay hidden. That was what he believed with every part of his tired and aching body. He had no idea that everything was about to change. He had no idea that one random Saturday night would turn his whole world upside down. He had no idea that the piano was not done with him. Even close. It was a Saturday night in the middle of October, and the restaurant was buzzing with an energy he had never felt before. The owners had been preparing for this event for months, a big charity gala for some arts foundation in the city. Rich people from all over were coming to eat fancy food and write big checks and feel good about themselves. He had heard the managers talking about it for weeks. They wanted everything perfect. White tablecloths had to be spotless, and the silverware had to shine, and every single glass had to be polished until you could see your reflection. Ive showed up for his shift 3 hours early because they needed all hands on deck. The kitchen was chaos, and the front of house was even worse. Servers were running around fixing centerpieces and adjusting chairs and arguing about table assignments. Kept his head down and did what he was told. That was how he survived in this job. Just do the work and stay invisible and collect your paycheck at the end of the week. By 7 o'clock, the guests started arriving, women in long gowns and men in expensive suits. He watched them float through the front door like they owned the place. And honestly, some of them probably did. He recognized a few faces from the news and the newspapers, business owners and politicians and people who had more money than he would ever see in 10 lifetimes. There was a grand piano in the corner of the main ballroom. I'd noticed it many times before, but tonight it looked different. Tonight it was polished and positioned under a spotlight, like it was waiting for something important. Learned that a famous pianist was supposed to perform, some woman who had played at concert halls all over the world. She was the main entertainment for the evening, and people had paid thousands of dollars just to hear her play. He tried not to look at that piano too much. It made his chest feel tight in a way he did not want to deal with. Not tonight, not when he had 200 plates to carry and tips to earn. The first hour went smoothly. He moved between tables like a ghost, pouring wine and delivering appetizers and smiling that empty smile he'd perfected over the years. Nobody looked at him, and that was fine. He preferred it that way. Then something happened around 8:30. He noticed the managers huddled together near the kitchen door. Their faces were pale, and their voices were sharp and panicked. He could not hear what they were saying, but he could tell it was bad. Really bad. One of the other servers told him what happened. The pianist was stuck at the airport. Her flight had been canceled, and there was no way she was making it tonight. The main event of the entire gala was gone. 200 guests were expecting a world-class performance, and there was no one to give it to them. He watched the managers scramble. They made phone calls and sent texts and begged anyone they could think of to come fill in. But it was Saturday night, and every professional musician in the city was already booked. The clock was ticking, and the guests were finishing their main course, and soon they would be looking at that empty piano wondering what was going on. He felt something strange in his stomach, a pulling sensation like a rope was tied around his insides, and someone was tugging on. I looked at the piano sitting there under the spotlight, silent and waiting. His hands started to sweat and his heart began to beat faster. No, he was not going to do this. He was a server. He was invisible. He had no business sitting at that piano in front of all these important people. What if he messed up? What if they laughed at him? What if he lost his job for stepping out of line? He turned away and tried to focus on his tables. Just do your work, he told himself. This is not your problem. But the pulling would not stop. It got stronger with every minute that passed. He thought about all those nights alone in the church, all those hours playing in the dark, with no one listening. He thought about his grandmother and the first time she took him to hear piano music. He thought about the retired teacher who told him he had a gift. He thought about every dream he had buried and every sacrifice he had made. And every night he had cried at those keys because music was the only thing that made him feel alive. The managers were still panicking. One of them looked like she was about to cry. The head chef came out and started yelling about the schedule falling apart. Guests were glancing at the piano and checking their watches, and then his feet started moving. He did not make a decision. His body just moved on its own, like it knew something his brain was too scared to accept. He walked toward the back and found his manager. His voice came out shaky and quiet. He said he could play. The manager looked at him like he had spoken a foreign language. She asked him what he meant. He said it again. He could play the piano. He had been playing since he was a kid, and he knew classical music and jazz, and he could fill in for the night. The manager stared at him for what felt like forever. He could see the doubt in her eyes. He was just a server. How could he possibly replace a world-famous pianist? But desperation makes people do strange things. She looked at the empty piano and then back at him, and finally she nodded. She told him if he embarrassed the restaurant, she would fire him on the spot. He understood. He walked toward the piano, and every step felt like walking through water. His legs were heavy, and his chest was tight, and he could feel 200 pairs of eyes starting to notice him. Reached the bench and sat down. The spotlight was warm on his face. His hands were trembling as he placed them on the keys. For a moment, everything went quiet. The clinking of glasses stopped and the murmur of conversation faded, and the entire room seemed to hold its breath. He closed his eyes. He thought about the church. He thought about the darkness and the empty pews and the way the music sounded when no one was listening. Told himself this was no different, just him and the piano. Nothing else mattered. He pressed the first key. The note rang out clear and pure, and it filled the ballroom like a wave washing over sand. Then his fingers started to move. He played a piece he had loved since he was 15-something. slow and beautiful, that built and swelled and broke your heart. If you let, I forgot about the guests. He forgot about the managers watching from the corner. He forgot about the tips he was losing and the job he might not have tomorrow. He just played. The music poured out of him like water from a broken dam. Years of silence and sacrifice and hiding all came rushing through his fingertips. He played the sadness of losing his grandmother. He played the exhaustion of working double shifts. He played the loneliness of being invisible, and somewhere in the middle of all that pain, he found something else. Joy, pure and golden joy that he had almost forgotten existed. When he finished that first piece, he opened his eyes. The room was completely silent. He felt his stomach drop. This was it. They hated it. They were going to kick him out, and he would never work in the city again. Then someone started clapping, one person at it first, and then another, and then the whole room erupted. People were standing up from their chairs. Women were wiping their eyes. Men were nodding with their mouths open. He sat there frozen, not understanding what was happening. The manager who had threatened to fire him was standing in the corner with tears running down her face. He played for another hour that night. He played everything he knew, and some things he made up on the spot. He played until his fingers ached and his heart felt like it might burst. When he finally stood up, the applause was deafening. People crowded around him, shaking his hand and asking his name and telling him they had never heard anything like that before. Older woman with silver hair and sharp eyes pushed through the crowd. She introduced herself and said she used to teach at one of the most famous music schools in the country. She looked him straight in the eyes and said something he would never forget. She told him that in 30 years of teaching, she had rarely seen raw talent like his. She asked him where he had been hiding. He did not know what to say. He had been right here the whole time, carrying plates and filling water glasses and dreaming about a life he thought he could never have. But standing there in that ballroom with the spotlight still warm on his skin, he realized something had shifted. The secret was out, and there was no putting it back. He woke up the next morning, thinking it had all been a dream. His alarm went off at 6, like always, and he lay there staring at the ceiling, trying to remember what was real and what was not. Did he really play piano in front of 200 rich strangers last night? Did they really give him a standing ovation? Did that woman with the silver hair really tell him he had rare talent? It felt impossible, like something that happened to other people in movies, but never to someone like him. He dragged himself out of bed and made coffee and checked his phone. That was when everything changed. He had 47 missed calls. His voicemail was full. His text messages were blowing up with numbers he did not recognize. His social media accounts that he barely ever used had thousands of notifications. His hands started shaking as he scrolled through the messages. People were tagging him in posts and sending him links and asking if he was the guy from the video. What video? He clicked on one of the links, and his phone loaded a page that made his heart stop. There he was, sitting at that grand piano in the ballroom. The video was 3 minutes long, and it showed him playing with his eyes closed and tears streaming down his face. Did not even remember crying, but there it was for the whole world to see. Video had been posted by the older woman with the silver hair, the one who said she used to teach at a famous music school. She had recorded the whole thing on her phone and shared it with her followers, and she had a lot of followers, hundreds of thousands of people who trusted her opinion on music and art. Her caption said something that made his throat tighten. She wrote that in 30 years of teaching at one of the best schools in the country, she had never witnessed anything quite like this. She said this young man was a server at the restaurant, and he had stepped in at the last minute when the scheduled pianist could not make it. She said his playing was raw and emotional and deeply moving, and the world needed to hear his story. By the time he watched the video, it already had over 1 million views. 1 million people had seen him cry at a piano. 1 million strangers now knew his face. He did not know whether to laugh or throw up. His phone rang again, and this time he answered it. was a woman from a morning news show asking if he would come on for an interview. He said he needed to think about it and hung up. 2 seconds later, another call came in. Producer from a radio station wanted to talk, then a journalist from a newspaper, then someone claiming to be from a record label. His tiny apartment felt like it was shrinking around him. He could not breathe. Grabbed his jacket and walked outside, hoping the fresh air would help him think. But even the street felt different. Now a woman at the bus stop looked at him and then looked again. She pulled out her phone and glanced at the screen, and then back at him. She asked if he was the piano guy from the video. He did not know what to say, so he just nodded. She told him she cried watching it and that he was incredibly talented. Then she asked if she could take a picture with him. This was not his life. This could not be happening. He smiled for the photo and then walked away as fast as he could. When he got to the restaurant for his shift, the manager met him at the door. She looked different today, nervous and excited and unsure all at the same time. She told him the phone had been ringing off the hook all morning. News crews wanted to come film at the restaurant. Customers were calling to ask if the piano player would be performing again. The owners had already seen the video, and they were talking about what to do next. Stood there in his server uniform, feeling completely lost. 24 hours ago, he was invisible. Now the whole city seemed to know his name. The day got stranger from there. He tried to work his normal shift, but people kept recognizing him. Guests would whisper and point and ask if he was the one from the video. Some of them wanted autographs, others just wanted to shake his hand and tell him how much his music touched them. One older man grabbed his arm and said he reminded him of his son who had passed away. The son used to play piano too. The man had tears in his eyes, and all he could do was stand there and try not to fall apart. By the end of his shift, he was emotionally exhausted. He had smiled and nodded and said, "Thank you," so many times that his face hurt. He went home and turned off his phone and sat in the dark for 2 hours. This was too much. He was not built for this. He was just a guy who played piano alone in an empty church. Did not know how to handle attention like this, but the world did not care if he was ready. The video kept spreading. By the second day, it had 5 million views. By the third day, it was on the national news. People started calling him the piano waiter. They made memes about him and wrote articles about him and argued in comment sections about whether he was really that good or just lucky. Some people said he was a genius who had been overlooked by the system. Others said he was overhyped and riding a wave of sympathy. He read every single comment, even though he knew he should not. The nice ones made him feel strange and undeserving. The mean ones cut deeper than he wanted to admit. One person wrote that he was not that special and anyone could play piano if they practiced enough. Another said he was only famous because the real pianist did not show up. Part of him believed they were right. Who was he to think he deserved any of this? He had not gone to music school. He did not have fancy training or a degree or any credentials to his name. He was just a server who played piano in secret. The world had stumbled onto his hidden life, and now he did not know who he was anymore. But something else was happening, to something he had not expected. People started reaching out with real opportunities at music school. In the city offered him a full scholarship. They said they had watched the video and they wanted him to study with their best professors. A small record label sent him an email asking if he had ever thought about recording an album. A concert venue offered him a slot to perform for a real audience. Each offer felt like a door opening to a room he had never been allowed to enter. But with each door came a new fear. What if he walked through and found out he did not belong? What if the world realized he was not as talented as that one video made him seem? What if this was all a mistake and everyone would laugh when they discovered the truth? He called his sister because she was the only one who could calm him down when his brain started spiraling. She listened to him ramble for 20 minutes about all his fears and doubts and insecurities. Then she asked him one simple question. She asked him what he would tell his 7-year-old self, the little boy who walked into that church with his grandmother and heard piano music for the first time. Would he tell that boy to stay hidden forever? Would he tell him to never try because he might fail? He did not have an answer right away, but later that night he walked to the church like he always did. He let himself in with the key the custodian had given him. He sat at the old piano in the dark, and he played not for views or fame or record labels. For himself, just to remember why he started in the first place. When he finished, he sat there for a long time. He thought about everything that had happened in the past few days. The video and the calls and the offers and the fear. He thought about his mother who was still recovering, and his sister who believed in him, and his grandmother who was gone, but somehow still watching. And he made a decision. He was not going to hide anymore. He did not know where this path would lead. He did not know if he would succeed or fail or end up right back where he started. But he was done being invisible. The world had seen him now, and maybe it was time he let himself be seen too. The weeks that followed were nothing like he imagined. Thought once he made the decision to stop hiding, everything would fall into place. He thought the path forward would be clear and straight and easy to follow, but life does not work that way, especially when the whole world is suddenly watching. The first meeting was with a big record label in a tall glass building downtown. He took the bus there wearing the nicest clothes he owned, which was just a button-up shirt and some old dress pants. The office was on the 32nd floor, and the elevator made his stomach drop when the doors opened. He stepped into a world that felt like another planet. Everything was white and shiny, and expensive-looking people in designer suits walked around talking on phones and carrying tablets and looking important. A woman with perfect hair led him to a conference room where 5 executives sat around the long table. They smiled at him like he was a product they were thinking about buying. The meeting lasted 2 hours. They talked about image and branding and market positioning. They showed him charts about streaming numbers and social media engagement. They asked him what kind of artist he wanted to be, and before he could answer, they told him what kind of artist he should be. They wanted him to make pop music simple, catchy songs that would play on the radio and go viral on social media. They said classical piano was a niche market and jazz was even smaller. If he wanted to be successful, he needed to give people what they wanted, not what he wanted to play. He sat there nodding and trying to keep up, but inside he felt something heavy sinking in his chest. This was not what he dreamed about all those years in the church. He did not play piano to become a brand. Played because the music lived inside him and needed to come out. When the meeting ended, they handed him a contract and told him to think about it. I took it home and read it 3 times. The numbers were bigger than anything he had ever seen. More money than his mother made in 10 years of working, more than enough to pay off every bill and take care of his family forever. But there were strings attached. They would own his music. They would control his image. They would decide what he played and when he played it and how he looked while doing it. Put the contract in a drawer and did not look at it again. The next opportunity came from the music school. They flew him out to visit the campus and meet the professors. It was beautiful there, with old brick buildings and practice rooms and students carrying instrument cases everywhere he looked. For a moment he let himself imagine what it would be like to be one of them, to spend his days learning and growing and surrounded by people who understood the language of music. The professors were kind and encouraging. They told him he had raw talent that most students would spend years trying to develop. They said, with proper training, he could become one of the great pianists of his generation. But there was a problem. The school was across the country, 3,000 miles away from his mother and his sister and everything he had ever known. He asked if he could defer for a year, and they said no, the scholarship was for this semester only. Take it or leave. I flew home with his head spinning. How could he choose between his dream and his family? His mother still needed help getting around after her surgeries. His sister was finishing her last year of college and counting on him for support. If he left, who would take care of them? He did not sleep that night or the night after. He worked his shifts at the restaurant during the day and lay awake staring at the ceiling until morning. The pressure kept building from every direction. His phone never stopped buzzing with messages from people he did not know. Journalists wanted interviews, and podcasters wanted him on their shows, and strangers on the internet had opinions about everything he did. Some days he felt like he was drowning, like the attention that was supposed to be a blessing had become a weight around his neck, pulling him under. He stopped going to the church at night. He told himself he was too tired, but the truth was different. Piano had become connected to all this chaos and confusion. When he sat at those keys now, he did not feel peace anymore. He felt pressure to be great, pressure to live up to what everyone expected, pressure to figure out his whole life before it was too late. One night his sister came over for dinner. She could tell something was wrong the moment she walked in. He had dark circles under his eyes, and his hands were shaking, and he barely touched his food. She asked him what was going on, and he told her everything: the record label and the contract and the music school and the impossible choice. He told her he felt like a fraud, like he had fooled the whole world into thinking he was something special when really he was just a tired server who played piano in an empty church. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. Then she reminded him of something he had forgotten. She told him about the night their grandmother passed away. He had been sitting by her hospital bed holding her hand when she opened her eyes one last time. She was weak and her voice was barely a whisper, but she said something to him. She said the music was never just for him. It was a gift meant to be shared. She said he had been hiding it for too long, and one day the world would need to hear what he had inside. He had buried that memory somewhere deep because it hurt too much to hold, but hearing it now from his sister broke something open in his chest. He started crying and could not stop. All the fear and exhaustion and confusion came pouring out. His sister held him and let him fall apart. When he finally calmed down, she said one more thing. She said their grandmother did not raise a quitter, and neither did their mother. The next day he went to visit his mother at her apartment. She was sitting in her wheelchair by the window watching the birds outside. He sat down next to her and told her about the scholarship and how it meant moving across the country. He told her he could not leave her. He told her the family needed him here. She looked at him with those tired, wise eyes that had seen more struggle than anyone should ever have to see, and she shook her head. She told him the family did not need him to stay stuck. They needed him to fly. She said she had spent her whole life working jobs she hated so her children could have better. She did not do all that just to watch him turn down the chance of a lifetime. Then she said something that hit him like a punch to the heart. She told him that watching him hide his gift for all these years was the most painful thing she ever witnessed, more painful than the surgeries and the recovery and all the hard days, because she knew what he was capable of, and she knew he was letting fear win. Her words echoed in his head for days. He walked around the city replaying them over and over. He went back to the church one night and sat at the piano for the first time in weeks. His fingers felt stiff and unfamiliar on the keys, but he played anyway. He played until the rust fell away and the music started flowing again. He played until he remembered why he fell in love with this instrument in the first place. And when he finished, he knew what he had to do. He was going to turn down the record label contract. He was not going to let anyone else control his music. He was going to accept the scholarship and move across the country. He was going to trust that his family would be okay. He was going to stop letting fear make his decisions. It was the hardest choice he ever made, but for the first time in months, he felt something he had almost forgotten. He felt hope, and hope was enough to take the next step. 18 months had passed since he boarded that plane with 2 suitcases and a heart full of doubt. 18 months since he hugged his mother goodbye and promised to make her proud. 18 months of early mornings and late nights and more practice than he ever thought possible. The music school was everything he dreamed it would be and nothing like he expected. The first few weeks were brutal. He walked into classes with students who had been playing since they were toddlers, kids who grew up with private tutors and concert grand pianos in their living rooms. They could sight-read pieces that took him weeks to memorize. They spoke about composers and techniques, using words he had never heard before. He felt like a fraud all over again, like everyone would soon realize. He did not belong there, but he did not quit. He woke up before sunrise every single day and practiced until his fingers cramped. He stayed after class to ask questions that probably seemed basic to everyone else. He checked out books from the library and watched videos and studied until his eyes burned slowly. The gaps started to close. His professors noticed something different about him. They said he played with an emotion that could not be taught. Technical skill could be learned, but the ability to make people feel something was rare. That was his gift. That was what set him apart from students who had been trained their whole lives. He learned to trust it, learned to stop comparing himself to others and focus on his own path. He also learned he was not alone. There were other students who came from nothing, kids who grew up poor and worked their way in through scholarships and determination. They formed a small group and supported each other through the hard days. For the first time in his life, he had friends who understood him, people who knew what it felt like to sacrifice everything for a dream. He called his mother every Sunday night. She was doing better now. His sister had graduated college and moved closer to help take care of her. They sent him photos and updates and reminded him that home was always waiting, but they also pushed him to keep going, to not look back, to see this journey through to the end. The months flew by faster than he could track. He performed in student recitals and small showcases. He entered competitions and sometimes won and sometimes lost. Each experience taught him something new about himself and his music. He started composing again, not just playing pieces written by others, but creating his own. He wrote music about his grandmother and the church and the restaurant and the long nights alone. He wrote about being invisible and then being seen. He wrote about fear and hope and everything in between. One of his professors heard his compositions and encouraged him to record them. With help from the school, he put together a small album, nothing fancy, just him and a piano in a quiet room. He released it online without any label or marketing team. Just his music out in the world for anyone who wanted to listen. The response was slow at first, a few hundred streams and some nice comments, but then something shifted. People who remembered the viral video from the restaurant started finding the album. They shared it with friends, and the numbers began to climb. Music blogs wrote about him. They called him a unique voice in a world full of imitation. They said his sound was honest and raw and deeply human. The album never hit the top of any charts, but it found its audience, people who needed to hear exactly what he was playing. Mothers who had lost their own parents, workers who felt invisible in their jobs, dreamers who had given up and needed a reason to try again. His music became a bridge connecting strangers across the world, and that meant more to him than any award ever could. Then came the invitation. A letter arrived at the school, addressed to him. He almost threw it away, thinking it was junk mail. But something made him open it. Inside was an offer that stopped his heart. A famous concert hall wanted him to perform not as a student or an opening act, as the main event. One night on one of the most legendary stages in the world. He read the letter 5 times to make sure he was not imagining things. Concert hall had been the dream of every pianist he admired. Greatest musicians in history had played on that stage, and now they wanted him, a former server who learned piano in a church basement. He called his mother that night, and she cried so hard she could barely speak. His sister screamed into the phone and made him promise to get them tickets. The next few months were a blur of preparation. Practiced harder than he ever had in his life. He fine-tuned every piece and rehearsed every transition. Worked with coaches on breathing and posture and stage presence, but no matter how much he prepared, the fear never fully went away. The night before the concert, he could not sleep. He lay in his hotel room staring at the ceiling. Every doubt he had ever felt came rushing back. What if he forgot the notes? What if his hands froze? What if he walked out there and proved to everyone that he did not deserve this? Around 3 in the morning, he got out of bed and did something he had not done in a long time. He prayed not to anyone specific, just out loud to the empty room. He talked to his grandmother like she was sitting right there beside him. He told her he was scared. He told her he missed her. He told her he wished she could be there to see how far he had come. Then he felt something strange, a warmth in his chest, like a gentle hand pressing against his heart. He did not hear her voice, but somehow he knew she was listening. The next evening he arrived at the concert hall 2 hours early. The building was enormous and beautiful, with tall columns and golden lights. He walked through the backstage halls and tried to breathe. His mother and sister were already in the audience, front row seats. He had made sure of that. When he peeked through the curtain, he saw the crowd filing in, hundreds of people dressed in elegant clothes, critics and musicians and fans who had followed his journey since that first viral video. The stage manager gave him the signal. It was time. He walked out under the spotlight, and the applause washed over him like a wave. He saw his mother in her wheelchair with tears already streaming down her face. He saw his sister clutching her hand and smiling so wide it looked like it hurt. He saw strangers who had become fans and supporters who believed in him before he believed in himself. He sat down at the piano, the same kind of grand piano he had played that night at the restaurant, the same keys that changed his life forever. He placed his hands on the ivory and closed his eyes. For a moment he was back in the church, sitting in the dark with no one watching, playing for the pure love of music. Then he began. The first notes rang out through the concert hall, clear and pure and full of everything he had carried for 27 years. He played for 2 hours without stopping. He played his grandmother's favorite hymns and his own original compositions. He played jazz and classical and pieces that did not fit into any category. Played the story of his life, every struggle and every sacrifice and every moment of doubt. And somewhere in the middle of it all, he realized something. He was not invisible anymore. He never had been. The music had always been there, waiting for him to be brave enough to share it. When he played the final note, the silence lasted for what felt like an eternity. Then the audience erupted. People rose to their feet. The applause was deafening. Stood up from the bench and looked out at the crowd. His mother was sobbing, and his sister was cheering, and strangers were wiping their eyes. He thought about the boy who walked into that church with his grandmother all those years ago. The boy who pressed a single key and felt the whole world stop. That boy had no idea what was coming. He had no idea that the music would save him over and over again. He bowed to the audience, and the applause continued, and for the first time in his life he let himself believe I belonged here. He always had. The music had just been waiting for him to catch up.